On March the 10th, 93, Secretary of State Warren Christopher made the following opening statement at the news conference in D.C. Quote, "I believe we now have an opportunity to promote peace that will serve the interests of Israel and the Arab states, the Palestinians, and the entire community. A passive American role is not enough. What is called for is an active, positive effort that will take advantage of what many believe to be a historic moment in that region. We must now seize this opportunity to play the role of full partner. Full partner in what, Mr. Secretary? Well, to make Israel give away their land. Okay. The very next day, weather patterns began to show a very unusual change in the Gulf of Mexico. That turned into a huge storm later called, quote, the storm of the century, as it battered the eastern United States for 4 days. The storm affected 26 states, impacting the lives of nearly 100 million people. At one point, the storm covered 1/3 of the United States. Up to 120-mile-per-hour winds, 56 inches of snow. All East Coast airports closed for the first time ever. 318 people died, $6.6 billion in damages. Kind of a weird coincidence, ain't it? Happened just within 24 hours. Well, after intense behind-the-scenes contracts and negotiations running from April the 27th, and notice these dates, folks. These are very important dates. To September 13th of 93, between Israeli and Palestinian negotiators in Oslo, Norway, a compromise peace agreement was signed between Shimon Peres and Yasser Arafat. This famous agreement was signed at the White House. Many of you will remember that picture, with President Clinton and Bush and Carter as witnesses. Watch now. Remarkably, during the exact same time period, record flooding occurred across the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois. The Great Midwest Flood of 93 went down as the, quote, the most devastating flood in modern United States history. The magnitude and the severity of this flood was simply overwhelming. It ranks as one of the greatest natural disasters ever to hit the United States due to the area of extent, intensity, and duration of the flooding. Well, didn't we just read a moment ago that God would send floods? You say, well, God don't do stuff like that. Well, you might want to talk to Noah about floods. Does it seem odd that as the heartland of Israel was being negotiated away, the heartland of America was being devastated away? At the end, the final bill was $21 billion in damages. Well, then, of course, on January the 16th, 94, the well-known terrorist and Israeli hater, President Hafez el-Assad of Syria's Arab Republic, and President Bill Clinton met in Geneva, Switzerland, to talk about a peace agreement with Israel. The agreement included Israel giving up the Golan Heights. Now, if you read in the Bible, when it talks about this areas that were to be given to certain ones, this is the land that was to given to the tribes of Dan and Manasseh. This is called in the Bible Bashan. This is God's property. And they're told that they have to, and they're doing this, America is doing this with the most notorious Israeli hater of all time. Well, the very next day, on January 17th, a powerful 6.9 Northridge earthquake rocked Southern California. The earthquake, centered about 25 miles north of Los Angeles in the porn capital of the world, cost $15.3 billion in damages. The earthquake was the second most destructive natural disaster ever to hit the United States, second only to Hurricane Andrew. And isn't it bizarre, folks, that this happened within 24 hours? John, that's a weird coincidence, ain't it? Yeah, it kind of is. Kind of a weird coincidence. Well, here's one that's interesting. On January the 21st, 98, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with President Clinton at the White House, but was coldly received because the Prime Minister was not willing to give up the West Bank, which, by the way, is the issue right now going on. Both President Clinton and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright refused to have lunch with him because he refused to give up land. And by the way, he was a good guy. But notice this, folks. Later on that very same day, the Monica Lewinsky scandal breaks out, resulting in Clinton's impeachment. How ironic that the very same day that Netanyahu was facing his government being expelled by Clinton's insistence, that Clinton ended up seeing it happen to himself. And I'm reminded of the prophet Obadiah that warned of judgment that would come on the wicked that would attack Israel. In Obadiah 1:15 it says, "The day of the Lord is near upon all the heathen. As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. Thy reward shall be returned on thine own head." Kind of coincidence, though, ain't it? Just kind of bizarre coincidence here. Well, then on September the 28th, 1998, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright finishes the final details of an agreement which required Israel to surrender 13% of Judea and Samaria, part of God's promised covenant land. Meanwhile, Bill Clinton meets with Yasser Arafat and Netanyahu in the White House to finalize another Israeli land for peace. Later, Arafat addresses the UN and declares the independent Palestinian state by May of 1999. That same day, Hurricane George blasts the Gulf Coast, 110-mile-per-hour winds, and gusts up to 175 miles per hour. The hurricane hit the coast, and temporarily stalled until the agreement was finalized, and Arafat addressed the UN in New York. Then it hit hard and caused a final total of $6 billion in damage. By the way, when Arafat finished his speech and left the United States, the storm began to dissipate. Kind of a weird coincidence. Then, of course, on November 30th, 98, Arafat arrives again to Washington to meet with the president and to raise money for the Palestinian state, this time declaring Jerusalem as their capital. A total of 42 other nations were represented in Washington, and the nations agreed to give Arafat a $3 billion aid. To do what? To get Israel out of their own land. Now listen to this. Clinton promised $400 million. The European nations promised $1.7 billion. And yet, that exact same day, the Dow Jones dropped 216%. Then that following day, the European market had its third worst day in their history. Now let's stop for a second. Don't you remember there in Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26, God says, "I'll bless you coming in and bless you going out. I'll make you head and not to tail. I'll cause prosperity to overtake you. It'll run you down and tackle you." Well, we always read the first part of the chapters. Why don't we get to the end? Where God says, "But if you don't do this, then I'll curse you going in and curse you going out. I'll make you a tail, not the head. I'll cause you to be cursed in every direction you go. Your money will become worthless. You will have to borrow and not be able to lend." Let's read the whole book, folks. How ironic that hundreds of billions of market capitalization were wiped out in the United States and Europe after making promises for the development of a Palestinian state. Just so happened to be the same day, within 24 hours. Yeah, that is a weird coincidence.